Well, hello again, it's Alister McGrath, and well, here we are with the final lecture in this series. I very much enjoy speaking to you, but I'm afraid I also have to apologise for not being able to be with you in present, or indeed be able to have this in the Oxford Lecture Theatre. COVID has stopped everything. Now, a lot of lecturers, of course, will end their course of lectures by reviewing what they said, and I don't want to do that. What I want to do instead is to move the discussion ahead. I want to focus on how you can take things further from here. What can you do to develop your own ministry as an apologist? And let me be clear what I mean by this. Some of you will perhaps develop professional ministries, maybe through churches or parachurch agencies, in which apologetics plays a significant role. But as far as I'm concerned, if you talk to your family and friends about your faith, well, that's an apologetic ministry. And what I want to do in this final lecture is to hand over to you, in effect, enabling you to establish your own way of doing apologetics. So let's begin by thinking about the relation of evangelism and apologetics and how theology comes into this. Now, apologetics is really about giving reasons for faith, showing you that faith makes sense, that it's important, that it's life-changing. It's about persuading people that Christianity makes sense, that becoming a Christian does not mean committing intellectual suicide. And I think that's very important, although obviously there is more to it than that. Apologetics certainly aims to deal with barriers to faith, giving reasoned and thoughtful replies which allow our audience to appreciate to the full the attraction and the coherence of the Christian faith. In particular, it's about setting out the full attractiveness of Jesus Christ so that those outside the faith can begin to grasp why he merits such serious consideration. So how might theology come into this? I think that's a very fair question. And here's how I'd begin to answer that question. I think I'd point out that theology enables us to appreciate our faith for all it's worth. And that, I think, is good news for us because it deepens the quality of our faith. There's nothing worse, in my view, than superficial faith. But it also allows us to begin to appreciate why Christianity might be attractive to other people. And as you know, Jesus once compared the kingdom of heaven to a pearl of great price in Matthew chapter 13. We talked about this in the previous lecture. It's all about a merchant looking for fine pearls. When he found one that was of great value, he went away and sold everything in order to possess it. And see, the point is that the merchant realized that this was very, very valuable, very, very important. In fact, so beautiful and valuable, it was worth giving up everything so that he could possess it. And you might like to think of yourself as an apologist as being charged with the responsibility of helping people realize the Christian faith is so exciting and so wonderful that there's really nothing else that can be compared to it. In other words, you've got to help people to grasp the attractiveness of faith. And theology allows us to do this. It allows us to identify and to appreciate the individual elements of the Christian faith and how these might connect up with the people we're talking to. If you like, it's a bit like opening up a treasure chest and holding up jewels, pearls, and precious metals one by one, so that each of these can be individually seen and, more importantly, individually appreciated. Now, I remember in the fourth lecture I talked about Newton's prism breaking down white light into its constituent colours. Each of these are different, and the key point is that you can do the same. You can take the Christian faith and break it down into its multiple elements, explaining why each of them are so interesting and how they connect up with people. So theology helps us to appreciate and explain the richness of the gospel, and also, I think, how this speaks powerfully and persuasively to the human condition. So again, to make this point, just as a prism breaks up a beam of white light into the beautiful colours of the rainbow, so theology allows us to separate out the individual elements of the Christian gospel. You're not losing them. You're allowing them to be seen individually. Theology, if you like, is the tool that allows the many facets of the gospel to scintillate brilliantly. So, theology helps us to appreciate the richness of the Christian vision of the gospel and to make connections with the human situation. So it's good for us as believers, but it's good also for people we're talking to. Apologetics then is basically about affirming the truth and the attractiveness of the Christian gospel. It's a kind of pre-evangelism. It prepares the way for an invitation to be issued by helping people to understand what Christianity is all about and why it is so attractive and so meaningful. So how then do we understand the relationship between apologetics and evangelism? Well, you see, evangelism is really about issuing a personal invitation to come to faith and to become a Christian. If you like, apologetics and theological analysis prepare the ground for this invitation. They help to clear away obstacles. They help people to appreciate what the gospel is all about. But all of this is preparatory. It leads up to the invitation in evangelism to open a door, to extend a hand, to open our hearts, and to enter the kingdom of God. So that's helpful to get our thinking started. But I thought it might be now helpful to tell you about how I became a Christian apologist. My case isn't normal or typical, but I don't think anybody's is really. But this may help you as you think things through for yourself. What kind of apologist am I going to be? Maybe the story of how I became one will just help you to make some connections and figure out where you might go in the future. So I think it's a very interesting question. Let me tell you about it. Now, I never expected to become a Christian apologist, and the reason for that is I never expected to be a Christian. I was a teenager growing up in the city of Belfast during the 1960s, and at that time I was deeply affected by Marxism and a very aggressive scientism, which held that nothing could be known beyond the natural sciences, for the very simple reason there was nothing beyond them to be known. Now, I assumed that this scientific atheism would actually be my permanent intellectual homeland. But in reality, it turned out to be a temporary place of exile, like the prodigal son in a distant country, from which I would later return wiser and, I have to say, somewhat chastened. So I went to Oxford University, where I was an undergraduate studying science, and there I began to appreciate the limits placed on human reasoning, but also to grasp, I think, for the very first time, the intellectual capaciousness of Christianity. And you know, I never lost my love for the natural sciences or my admiration for the methods it had developed for investigating and representing our complex world. In fact, nor did I lose sight of the Marxist insight into the importance of social and historical location in shaping human thought. And indeed, those of you who know my writing well will be aware these insights helped me to shape my theological agenda and method. But what I have done is, in effect, taken my Marxism, my love of science, which date from my period as an atheist, and used them in the service of the Christian faith. And like Augustine of Hippo before me, I now regard these as being like the treasure that the people of Israel took with them when they left Egypt, as they sought to mold their identity on their way through the wilderness to the promised land. Now, I began to read C.S. Lewis in February 1974, and you know, that was a landmark in my life, because I soon became aware that his seemingly very simple reflection on faith actually rested on a very deep intellectual and imaginative assimilation of the Christian tradition, which he acquired over decades. Now, here's the point I'm going to make. I began to realize that my past history prepared me for my future ministry. I wonder if you can see what I mean. You see, I used to be an atheist and I knew all the arguments against faith because I myself held them once. But now I know the answers to those arguments. And so during the 1990s, I became an apologist. If you like, my past history gave me resources to engage in an apologetic ministry. But this took a very specific focus when I took part in a three-way private debate at Oxford University on the rationality of religious belief in the light of the natural sciences. And I had two atheist opponents in this debate. Peter Atkins, who was an Oxford physical chemist who actually taught me quantum theory many years ago, and Richard Dawkins, an Oxford evolutionary biologist. So there were three of us there arguing. They argued against me, I argued against them. What that debate did was to convince me there was an urgent need to engage the field of science and religion, as I was now certain that an increasingly important public debate on the rationality of Christian faith was in the process of emerging. And I was also convinced that the natural sciences would be the chosen weapon of those who opposed Christianity. And you know, I was right. Because the new atheism, which I talked about in the previous lecture, came along shortly afterwards. But you see, as a result of that earlier debate, I was ready for it. And I was able to take part and play a major role. Now, I'd say a lot more about my own situation, but actually it isn't really of enormous importance. What I really want you to think about is whether your past history may give you resources for a present or a future apologetic ministry. In my own case, I was an atheist who became a Christian, and I knew why I did that. I knew the obstacles I faced, and I knew how I got round them. And like C.S. Lewis before me, I realized that this prepared me to speak to people who were now atheists. I could, so to speak, step into their worldviews and sow seeds of doubt within them. Can you really prove that atheism is right? Well, no, they can't. And if you can't, then surely atheism is a faith, a belief system. Why should someone prefer your belief system to some other belief system, such as Christianity? So here's my question to you. What worlds have you inhabited? What questions have you faced? And how might these help shape your own approach to apologetics? So to help you think these things through, I'm going to tell you about how I developed my own approach, as I think this may help you think this thing through for yourself. Let me tell you about my own approach to apologetics, and this is really about seeing apologetics rooted in theology. If you like, it's a big picture vision of the gospel. Because for me, Christianity is not simply about the spiritual transformation of the individual, though that's important. It's also about the articulation of a moral, an intellectual, and a spiritual vision with the capacity to capture the imagination and transform the mind of a wider culture. I have to say, personally, I've never seen theology as a retreat into a private realm of ideas. I've always seen it really as a kind of tool for establishing the foundation for public engagement, an engagement which allows the relevance and the vitality of faith to be explored and explained, and in fact, very often doing this in critical dialogue with its cultural representatives. I think Richard Dawkins, Peter Atkins, Christopher Hitchens, all of whom I've debated. So my own personal journey of faith has actually had a significant impact on my understanding of, well, for a start, the purpose and place of theology, but also about how I do apologetics and why apologetics is so important. You see, my teenage atheism arose partly because nobody helped me to see why Christianity was so interesting, to tell me what it really was, or even to set out possible responses to the criticisms I then levelled against it as a teenage atheist. I would now see Christian theology as being a publicly defensible vision of the Christian faith, which allows us to engage in public about the question of which worldview makes most sense of the world and how it transforms things. So, if you like, I'm firmly rejecting both the pietistic tendency to reduce Christianity to a privatized spirituality, and also the fundamentalist inclination to disengage from any serious conversation with secular culture. I can understand why some do this. They're worried about the risk of intellectual contamination. But if you don't engage, Christianity doesn't get heard. We need to do this. It seems to me that public theological engagement is best undertaken by people of faith, people like me, people like you, who can speak personally on behalf of this wonderful vision of reality, rather than by church officials who very often are compromised by their institutional pre-commitments, and sometimes I have to say by the moral baggage of institutional history. So I've talked quite a bit about the sort of thing that apologetics is all about. I guess the question is whether you think you could do this to an audience that you already know. So let's just begin to reflect on some of the things that apologetics does. And again, the question is, how would you go about doing this? First of all, we need to show that Christianity is able to make sense of reality, leading into the perhaps more significant assertion that it's able to transform the existence of people and communities. If you like, The gospel changes lives, it brings hope, and it brings meaning. So that's one obvious thing. The second is this: we need to engage critical questions and concerns about faith that are significant for many in our contemporary culture. You'll know what these are. What answers would you give? And very often, actually, people will simply want reassurance. Actually, there are answers to these questions. But it does really help if we are able to clear away misunderstandings and help people to realize that some objections are not actually as forceful as they might seem. That's why it's so important, I think, to stress that the new atheism criticizes religion on the basis of criteria it doesn't apply to its own positions. In other words, it's critical, but it doesn't like people criticizing it. And thirdly, we can offer criticism of alternative worldviews or dominant philosophies, like scientism, which often gain cultural ascendancy through accidents of history. It's a point which I'm sure you will know is stressed by Charles Taylor in that massive book, A Secular Age, which took me a very long time to read, I have to say. Now, all these three tasks are integral to Christian apologetics. And in my view, the cultural influence of new atheism over the period 2006 to 18 actually demonstrate the significance of all three of these areas of discussion and debate, both for Christian churches, but also, I think, for Christian theology. And I was myself heavily involved with these debates in Britain and North America, but alongside others, like, for example, John Lennox, an Oxford academic who was professor of mathematics, and Keith Ward, another Oxford academic who was a former Regius professor of divinity. Now, some theologians, I have to say, look down their noses at apologetics. They see it as a rather deplorable recent innovation. I don't see it that way, and I encourage you not to see it in that way either. It's an authentic way of doing theology, which rests on a deep immersion in the Christian theological tradition on the one hand, but also a passion to engage culture and a familiarity with that culture on the other hand. That's really important. And when I was challenging a new atheism, I focused on a number of issues that clearly needed to be engaged, both in terms of contesting the overstatements of some of its leading representatives, but also offering an alternative way of seeing things. For example, as I pointed out in an earlier lecture, both Richard Dawkins and Christopher Hitchens are clearly critically dependent on the warfare model of the relation of science and religion, and it's easily shown. This model is a social construction of the late Enlightenment, which is given added cultural significance by the social circumstances of late 19th century England. That's what I can do because of my academic specialization, but you will be able to meet different objections, different questions, and give different answers because of your personal history. So again, I think it's very important for you to reflect on what you have learned, what you have done, and how these might be brought to bear in apologetics. For example, in my own case, instead of talking about the warfare of science and faith, I talk about how science is enriched by faith. And certainly I know many of those who I've talked to have found that very attractive. Now, both Dawkins and his new atheist colleague Sam Harris depend excessively on a very naive scientism in rejecting the need to take seriously moral philosophy or theology. Yet this position, which holds that the natural sciences alone are able to establish truth, is actually easily shown to be intellectually circular, and actually it's really a matter of personal faith rather than proven fact. They think science is able to deal with everything and that nobody else has anything worth saying, but they haven't shown that. They've simply asserted that. Don't confuse assertion with argument. So for me, apologetics is best seen as a positive invitation to step inside the Christian big picture and to appreciate the quality of the way it's able to make sense of our world and our lives. And apologetics is really an invitation to see things in a new way, to step into this new way of looking at things, which Christianity insists is both true and trustworthy. Now, some apologists focus on demonstrating the truth of individual aspects of Christianity. For example, that's why so many people give detailed justifications of the existence of God. Now, I want to say how useful that is. But, you see, like G.K. Chesterton before me, I hold that what really matters is the big picture. the fact that there are all these multiple elements which you weave together, and they give you this big picture. Now, you may remember that in describing his own return to faith in 1903, Chesterton explained what drew him back. Listen to this. Numbers of us have returned to this belief, and we've returned to it not because of this argument or that argument, but because the theory, when it's adopted, works out everywhere. Because the coat, when it's tried on, fits in every crease. We return to it because it is an intelligible picture of the world. I want you to make sure you depict that picture. You show how Christianity makes sense of things and explain how it helps you. For Chesterton, the appeal of Christianity lies in its internal coherence and its external correspondence with the experiential world of ordinary people. And that, to me, is why theology is the best foundation for apologetics, and actually why the best apologetics is a public theology. Now, I don't expect you to share that view, but I think, I hope you can see why a good grasp of theology can be important apologetically. So let me make the point that theology is really, really helpful. Not everyone enjoys it quite as much as I do. But the point I want to stress is that we need multiple approaches to apologetics. I've talked a little bit about mine. I want to know what you think yours is going to be and how you're going to develop it. So let's talk a bit about how you might craft your own approach to apologetics. Now, let me make it clear, I'm not telling you how to do this. I'm simply trying to help you as you think this through. My advice is that you develop an approach to apologetics that you feel comfortable with. It's always unwise, I think, to buy into somebody else's approach. Sure, you can use somebody else's approach to help you develop your own approach, which is responsive to your own personal style, your experience, and of course, your personal gifts and your history. And that means that you can learn from others while at the same time retaining your own distinctive voice as an apologist. One good way of doing this is to make telling your own story part of your apologetic ministry. Let me explain what I mean by that, because it is actually a very helpful idea. Telling your own story of faith is important apologetically for many reasons. I think each of us has a story to tell. One of the reasons why I love reading biographies, and I have to say sometimes writing them as well, is because it helps me to understand how Christianity changes people, becomes part of their lives. People aren't kind of containers filled with ideas. They are rather living realities whose existence has been changed by the ideas that they embody. In our case, the Christian gospel. So your story might be about coming to faith, or it might be about growing in your faith. But whatever your story is, it needs to be told, and its significance appreciated. There's a very good biblical precedent for telling our stories as a way of demonstrating the ability of the gospel to change lives. For example, do you remember a few lectures back I talked about how Paul responded to some criticisms he faced in Jerusalem simply by telling his own story. And the story he told, of course, is of a life-changing encounter with the risen Christ, which both motivated his evangelistic ministry and also undergirded his fundamental conviction of the truth of the Christian faith. Something happened to Paul, which redirected the course of his life and the shape of his beliefs. So here's the point I'm making. By telling our stories, we bear witness to the capacity of the gospel to give us direction in life, to cope with uncertainty and difficulty, and to live meaningfully in what so often seems a confusing world. Now, you can do that. Think about what you might say, how your faith helps you to cope with difficulty, with failure, with suffering. And these stories don't depend upon verbal brilliance for their appeal. It's rather based on the fact they're real-life accounts of truthful and faithful living. And your personal narrative might serve as a testimony to the capacity of the gospel to change some lives and to give stability and purpose to others. Now, there's a really important point I need to make here. in our culture, a lot of people are concerned about whether Christianity actually works. What difference does it make? And that's a good question. Please take it seriously. Now, you see, traditional apologetics is based on showing that Christianity tells the truth. Now, I think that's important, and I try to do that myself. But you see, for me, Christianity works because it's true. A lot of people will want to know primarily if Christianity works. They will come to the truth bit later. Now, remember Pascal's famous injunction: make people wish that the gospel is true, and then show them that is. So you see, telling your own story of faith is about showing how the gospel works. It makes a difference. It changes people. And you can explain the difference it makes in your own case, and then you can move on to talk about its truth. And here's another point. I already mentioned this, but we can learn from other apologists, maybe some of those people who I've referenced in these lectures. And indeed, one of the things I've tried to do in this course of lectures is to introduce you to thinkers and approaches which I think you might find interesting and helpful, and really inviting you to work out where you take it from here. I'm handing over to you, if you like. I'm telling you that I and other people have found these people are really helpful, and I'm offering them to you for your consideration. But I'm not saying these people or approaches are right. I'm just saying I find them helpful. And my role is to help you understand these approaches and their representatives, and to see if they help you develop your own approach. So let's think more about this. Let's think the idea of a masterclass, where you try and learn from others who are established in the field. So who can we learn from? Well, I've made some suggestions, actually quite a lot of suggestions, in this set of presentations. And you can easily add to these by talking with other people, by reading books by apologists, or watching apologetic presentations. Look at who they use and how they use them. You can use writers like C.S. Lewis or Marilyn Robinson opportunistically or systematically. Opportunistically just means that you'll use them whenever you think they have something really engaging or accessible to say, and those two writers are actually very, very good for that. Systematically means that you use them as an integral part of your apologetic toolkit. They're your go-to people, so to speak. Personally, I recommend you use writers selectively and opportunistically to begin with, while you try to figure out whether you actually like working with them. Remember, you're in charge. You can use whoever you like and for whatever purpose. And what I suggest you do is to keep a notebook or a file of anything that looks useful or interesting, and weave it into your presentations. And here's something else. Keep notes of how well these people are received. If people like them, use them again. Now, here's an example from C.S. Lewis. It's not one I've really used in this series, and he's talking about the challenges that we face when we're thinking about the Trinity. Now, if you're dealing with Trinity, you can offer a theological or rational defense of the Trinity, which is something I do a lot. But interestingly, Lewis here takes a very different approach. He doesn't defend the Trinity as I did in the fourth lecture. Rather, he invites us to see things in a new way and realizing why we feel intellectually uncomfortable with the Trinity in the first place. And Lewis's argument is that we see things from a limiting and constrictive human perspective. So he suggests we think of ourselves as flatlanders, two-dimensional people who try, and thus fail, to visualize three-dimensional objects. I'm going to read to you from Lewis as he makes this point. I want you to see if this helps you see the Trinity in a new way. Flatlanders attempting to imagine a cube would either imagine the six squares coinciding and thus destroy their distinctness, or else imagine them set out side by side and thus destroy the unity. Our difficulties about the Trinity are of much the same kind. Now, what I want you to notice is what Lewis does not do. He doesn't offer his readers a defense of a doctrine of the Trinity, or indeed any new evidence for believing it. Instead, he provides a visual framework that allows us to perceive its apparent irrationality in a new way. and thus to realize that our previous difficulties arose from seeing this doctrine from a limited and limiting perspective. The Trinity is indeed a mystery, but that does not mean it's an irrationality. So there's Lewis. You can use lots of other people, either opportunistically or systematically. Keep reading, keep thinking, keep listening, and see who you build up as you go to people in developing your own approach. Now, I'm going to say a little bit more about this point, about the idea of a mystery. It's very often raised as a problem by rationalist critics of Christianity. Now, our minds struggle to even begin to cope with the immensity and the majesty of God, and Christian theology has long recognized that it's actually impossible for us to represent or describe God adequately using human language. If you like, the sheer vastness of God, the idea of the divine glory, means that human images and words are going to falter, if not break down completely, as we try to depict God fully and faithfully. And that's why this idea of mystery is so important. Now, the theological idea of a mystery is not something that's contradicted by reason. Rather, it's something that exceeds our reason's capacity to discern and describe. If you like, it transcends reason. It doesn't contradict reason. If we speak of some aspect of nature or God as a mystery, it's not about trying to shut down conversation or discussion. If anything, it actually stimulates reflection by opening our minds to intellectual vistas, which are simply too deep and broad to be fully apprehended by our limited human vision. What we tend to do, unfortunately, is to cope with a mystery by reducing it to what we can manage, and thus we end up distorting it by, in effect, trying to scale it down. And scaling down simply means distortion and limitation. And it's a real problem, I think, but it's not just theologians who have this problem. Everybody who deals with a complex reality ends up finding they face the same problem. Think, for example, of the great physicist Werner Heisenberg, very heavily involved in the development of quantum theory in the 1930s. He argued that scientific thinking is, really confronted with mystery. It, I quote, always hovers over a bottomless depth. Because of the limits placed on human understanding, we're confronted with what he calls the impenetrable darkness of the universe, and we struggle to find ways of talking about the universe which actually are good enough to deal with its complexity. Now, you'll recognize that problem. And Augustine of Hippo, a theologian I've talked about quite a lot in these lectures, offers us a very good account of the limits of our ability to capture God in neat formula. Here's a quote. If you think you've grasped God, it's not God you have grasped. In other words, if you can get your mind around something, well, it's not God. It's something else you might think is God, but it's not. Precisely because it would be so limited and impoverished if it's something that can be fully grasped by the human mind. Augustine's making the point that it's actually very easy to create God in our own likeness. A kind of self-serving human invention that may bear some passing similarity to God, but actually falls far short of the glory and majesty of the God who created and redeemed the world. In effect, God is just too big to fit into a simple little system. Actually, let me tell you a little story about Augustine, which I think makes this point rather nicely, and actually you can use this in your presentations. Augustine was Bishop of Hippo Regius, a Roman coastal town in North Africa. And when he was writing his major work on the Trinity, Augustine decided to take a break and went for a stroll along the beautiful beaches nearby. As he walked along the beach, he came across a young boy who was behaving, frankly, rather strangely. Over and over again, the boy went to the edge of the shoreline. He filled a spoon of seawater and then emptied this into a hole in the sand on the beach. Augustine watched him for a while. He was just mystified. What is going on here? And eventually, unable to make sense of it, he asked the boy what he was doing. Well, the boy pointed to the Mediterranean Sea, and he informed Augustine he was going to empty the Mediterranean into the hole he dug in the sand. Now, Augustine was a little bit skeptical. You can't do that. You will never fit that ocean into that tiny hole. Now, here's what the boy is supposed to have said back. And you're wasting your time writing a book about God because you'll never fit God into a book. Now, I need to tell you that there are just some awkward historical questions here about whether this story is completely reliable. But it's a nice story, and you can tell it. And it makes a very, very good point. I hope you can see what the point is. The point is that we simply cannot get the vastness of God into our tiny little minds. Our minds just aren't big enough to cope with the conceptual vastness of God, which is what, after all, is expressed in the theological notion of glory. The glory of God simply overwhelms us. So let me explore this theme a little bit further, because I think as I'm talking on behalf of Regent College of Vancouver, I think I'll tell you a story about the theologian J.I. Packer, who many of you will have read, who was, as you probably know, a long-term and much-loved faculty member of Regent College, who died in Vancouver last year. Now, I knew Packer well, and actually I learned a lot from him. One of his most distinctive themes is that theology is grounded in Scripture, and that theology aims to unpack the big picture of reality that we find in the Bible. I think it's a very helpful way of thinking about theology, and I do that myself to some extent. But back in 2016, Jim was teaching at the annual summer school run by Regent College. And he was asked what he hoped to do through his teaching that summer. Now, I'm going to read you his answer. I want you just to pick up the imagery that he uses. You can do this as well. Here's what he said. What I shall be saying to my class is, look, this is the biggest thing that ever was. And we Christians, most of us, still haven't appreciated its size. We've been Christians for years and years, and yet we haven't fully grasped it. Now, you see, for Packer, theology is about unpacking this biggest thing that ever was, faithfully and reliably. It's an act of witness to the wonder of who God is and to the wonder of what God has done for us. And above all, it's a reminder that God simply overwhelms our mental capacity. It's a problem for science, it's a problem for Christianity. Our minds are limited. They can't take things in fully. And the danger is that we reduce God and the gospel to what you and I can manage, what we can accommodate, and in doing so reduce it and distort it. So if you like, the concept of mystery is not about contradicting human rationality. It's rather something that calls into question the ability of our limited minds to gain a full grasp of our complex universe. Faith transcends the limits of human reason. Its vision of God is overwhelming, which means we can never fully take it in, and also it's why worship is so important apologetically. We can make some sense of God, that's theology, and yet we recognize that in the end we're confronted with something which forces us to our knees in adoration, and that's worship. Now, worship's very important apologetically. I remember meeting a couple who had been converted when they actually went to a worship service at Holy Trinity Brompton in the middle of London. And they told me what happened. They were there in this service. People were really very, very excited. And they realized the congregation had grasped something that they had missed. In other words, the worship pointed at something really significant that they had not yet discovered, but which was clearly transformative for other people. So the experience of worship actually became for them a gateway which led to their discovery of God and the gospel. And the word mystery captures this sense of something that's overwhelmingly beautiful and vast so well. Back, I think, to J.I. Packer. This is the biggest thing that ever was. He's right. And you and I need to share this with people and explain why it's so wonderful and the difference it makes. And here's the point I need to underscore. This biggest thing that ever was, to quote Jim Packer, motivates us to want to engage in apologetics and evangelism. Now, I think you can see why, but let me explain anyway. One of the Bible passages to which I return time and time again refers to the transformative impact of capturing a vision of God's glory. So what passage do I have in mind? Well, I'm going to tell you, but I'm afraid this may be controversial. I would say Isaiah chapter 6. But I know North Americans won't like this very much. But let's stay friends over this, okay? It's not a big deal. I'm going to read Isaiah 6. Let me be conciliatory. Isaiah 6 to you, and then make the application I want to. So I'm going to read this to you, listen to it. And it's all about the transformative impact of a vision of glory. Here we go. In the year that King Uzziah died, I saw the Lord high and exalted, seated on a throne, and a train of his robe filled the temple. Above him were seraphim, each with 6 wings. With 2 wings they covered their faces, with 2 they covered their feet, and with 2 they were flying. And they were calling to one another, Holy, holy, holy is the Lord Almighty. The whole earth is full of his glory. At the sound of their voices, the doorposts and thresholds shook, and the temple was filled with smoke. Woe to me, I cried. I am ruined, for I am a man of unclean lips, and I live among a people of unclean lips, and my eyes have seen the King, the Lord Almighty. Then one of the seraphim flew to me with a live coal in his hand, which he had taken with tongs from the altar. With it he touched my mouth and said, See, this has touched your lips. Your guilt is taken away, and your sin atoned for. Then I heard the voice of the Lord saying, Whom shall I send? Who will go for us? And I said, Here am I, send me. Now, I'm sure you know that passage very well. Now, do you see what's actually happening here? It's really interesting and I think really important theologically. The prophet catches a glimpse of God in all of God's glory and majesty, and he's simply overwhelmed by what he sees. And I want you to notice very carefully, this encounter with the glory of God has 2 outcomes. First of all, the prophet is utterly convicted of his sin. Woe to me! This is then dealt with. His guilt is taken away. His sin is atoned for. So what happens next? Well, let's look at the second outcome of catching a glimpse of the glory of God, because the prophet hears the call of Lord, Who will I send? And motivated and inspired by a vision of glory, he says, Here am I, send me. The second outcome of an encounter with the glory of God is a desire to do apologetics and evangelism in order to tell others about this vision of a glorious God that you and I know and cherish. Now, I hope you find that useful. It really reminds us of the importance of catching a vision of God and being inspired and nourished by it. But let's move on, because I have to close this final lecture now by talking about how you can develop your own apologetic ministry further. Now, a traditional way of developing your ministry as an apologist is through being asked to speak on apologetic themes, or if you're already engaged in church or student ministry, to include apologetic themes in sermons or talks. But you see, the rules have changed. It's not like that anymore. YouTube allows anyone with a video camera to post talks on the web and to promote them. And if people like what you say, you're going to gain a following. And that may well lead to invitations to speak at conferences or to write books. So you see, you can do this. You don't need to be asked. You can take the initiative. Podcasts, YouTube videos. So what sort of videos might you post? Well, my own recommendation is that you need to keep them short, as you may well have discovered through watching this set of 15 45-minute videos. Actually, they really are quite demanding. It's much easier to listen to short videos, say 7 to 10 minutes, especially if you make them interesting visually. So why don't you try scripting a short video, for example, something that's 1,000 words long? You might tell your own story, or you might deal with an apologetic question in your own way. And you can let your friends see it and offer feedback. And when you're ready, You can record it and post it and see what the reaction is. You can promote this on your social media. You can get your friends to help share it. And then, of course, there's podcasts. These are more demanding as they're generally longer, and maybe you need to post regularly to secure a following. But, this might be something you could think about doing. You might develop a podcast on apologetic themes, or you can find others who are doing something like this, and you can learn from them, listen to them, and ask yourself whether you could do this as well. I think you could. I want you to try and develop your own distinct approach because we need these. Things are changing. We need fresh voices, we need fresh approaches, and the best way of doing this is to, in effect, sow seeds by posting and see what happens. Now, I'm really sorry about this, but actually I'm running out of time. And I want to thank you so much for listening to me over these 15 lectures. And I want to wish you every blessing for your future, wherever that takes you. Again, I'm so sorry I haven't been able to meet you personally, but I hope I may have encouraged you and given you some ideas you may find helpful as you look to find your place and your calling as an apologist. So goodbye from Oxford, and thank you so much for listening.